Today's stories bring us down to Alabama, where there's sweet tea and hospitality aplenty. But what else lurks in those Alabama wetlands and woodlands? Nasty spirits? Lurking creepers? Perhaps some terrifying, unexplained creatures? Let's take a look with these allegedly true and scary stories from Alabama. Enjoy, and remember to send me your scary stories. Just go to darkstories.org. Also, I'm looking to put together a new podcast, all about people's scariest encounters at work. For those stories, send them over to us at eeriecast.com/submit. Now, let's begin. The Eyes That Follow. From Anonymous. In my younger years, my family moved a lot. My father was a traveling evangelist and would go wherever the holy word was needed. I've lived in many interesting places because of this, but my mind is drawn to one place in Alabama, a large white plantation house in the middle of nowhere. Now when I say white, I mean it was white when it was younger. Now it was a grayish primer color in some places, and just bare wood where the paint chipped in others. The paint wasn't the only thing off about this house. The wood in some places had rotted, and vines had grown along 7 of the 12 columns that hold the house up. It was the kind of house that moaned and groaned whenever a puff of wind blew by. Nights were often uncomfortable here, because of the constant noises causing you to believe someone was inside the house. Multiple times in the first week, I would wake up seeing my father walking around the house with a bat, claiming he had heard something. But the most unsettling thing the house had to offer was not the eerie night noises, but the giant portraits. These massive paintings lined the walls in every room. The smallest occupied the halls and bathroom, whilst the larger ones were housed by kitchens and bedrooms. Now, every large portrait was of a person, possibly the family of the previous owners of the place. These portraits were placed in such a spot that every inch of the room was visible to their vigilant eyes. Even though they were very pretty, they were quite weird, for they always gave off the feeling that they were watching me. Now, the feeling was not always present. Sometimes the feeling would follow me until I exited into the hallway and would return in another room. Being of a young age, I couldn't leave the house during the weekends and would be alone in the house more often than not. So, of course, I would jump on the chance for any form of entertainment. I discovered the echo on accident. Imagine my surprise when I threw my baseball against the wall of my room and heard a knock in response. Being a curious young lad, I knocked twice and received 2 knocks in response. I repeated this a few more times and always received a response. But eventually I ran out of places in my room that I hadn't knocked on. So instead, I went into the hallway. I knocked once and received no response. Then I tried twice. Silence. Thrice. Nothing. But then I felt something familiar. That feeling of being watched. I turned to see the kitchen and the portrait staring at me. As if under a spell, I made my way into the kitchen, and I knocked on the wall. 1 knock responded to me. This lasted for a few weeks, 4 to be exact. Then we had to move once again. I heard they destroyed the house a few years later so they could make a supermarket. The estate sold all the antiques except the large portraits. You see, they couldn't sell those, because there were small slits made on the eyes of every one of them. Don't Take the Candy. From Anonymous. This has been, and I'm fairly sure will be, the most horrifying experience of my life. I was around 5 or 6 years old. We lived in a middle-class, slightly shady neighborhood in Alabama. Nevertheless, my parents trusted me outside by myself, as long as I stayed in front of our house where they could see me. There had been a string of kidnappings in the area, the youngest being a 4-year-old, and the oldest being 9. But it was broad daylight outside, and in my parents' minds, nothing could have possibly happened, until it most certainly did. It was a normal Sunday afternoon. My mom was gone to pick up my 12-year-old sister Chelsea from a friend's house, and my dad was watching the football game, so I was outside by myself. There had been a baby blue, slightly beat-up old van around the scene of the kidnappings, and that's exactly what I saw cruising toward my cul-de-sac. The whole stranger danger thing had been thoroughly burned into my brain, but I was already a pretty reckless kid, and I didn't believe that it could ever happen to me. I chose to ignore the van, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw it inching towards me. It was about 15 feet away when a man in his early 40s or 50s stepped out. He had greasy black hair down to his shoulders, a goatee, and baggy pants with a black sweatshirt. He smiled at me, and I saw all of his missing teeth, the remaining ones brown and stained. When he talked, it sounded like he chain-smoked 6 packs of cigarettes a day.
"Hello, little boy," he said. "Would you like some candy?"
He inched closer.
"It's right there in my van if you want to come with me to get it."
He was smiling, but his eyes were full of nothing but bad intentions. I wasn't getting anything but bad vibes from this guy, so I declined the offer. But he kept going, all the while getting closer to me. Every time I said no, I could see him get more nervous and furious at the same time. So I got up, and I yelled no at him as loud as my little voice could manage. He made a grab at me, catching me by the wrist, beginning to drag me by the hand towards his van. I began to scream furiously and cry as my dad burst out the front door, seeing the man. My dad ran towards me just as the man let go of my wrist and ran to his van. He sped off, but not before my dad could hit the man's van with a bat. My dad brought me inside and called the police and my mom. My mom got there before the police did and began to cry hysterically, hugging me. I was questioned by the police, but I was too much in shock to even process the questions. A few hours later, the police found the van abandoned in a field, but the man was never caught. But it was what was in his van that will forever haunt me. Chains, duct tape, needles, and candy. Popular candies with needle holes in them. I didn't understand this at the time, but I was almost kidnapped. I'm 18 now. None of the other kids were ever found. It still haunts me to think about what would have happened if I had taken the candy. The Cry. From Val. This story takes place in a small town in Alabama. At the time, I was around 11 or 12 years old. I lived in an apartment complex, living with my dad and stepmother. There was a small playground on the property, and I would sometimes play out there as kids do. Only I rarely ever did because of odd, unexplainable occurrences. That day was different. I was cooped up in my room for too long, and I wanted to go out and play on the swing set. So I let my stepmother know where I was going, and I headed out to play. You see, from the very start, I had an uneasy feeling about this place. Over the years, this feeling got worse. But that day, I just had to be outside. However, this was a big mistake. I wish I'd never played on that playground. Behind it was a wooded area with an abandoned road, as well as a creepy abandoned church supposedly used for storage. I hated that church, and every time I passed it, it gave me chills. My stepmother always told me to stay away from the woods every time I went out to play. But that day, my curiosity got the better of me. I was a dumb kid, but this time I still don't know why I did what I did. I was on the swing set, like a typical kid, basking in the sun. Everything was sunshine and rainbows. But then, I began to hear these cries out in the woods. They were very close to me. The birds had gone dead silent, and the wind had stopped. I kept hearing the wailing of an infant. My instincts told me to run, but something else in me beckoned me to follow the cries, as if I needed to follow them, as if I needed to see. I felt as if I had no choice. I remember getting off the swing set and standing at the entrance of the woods, and I stood there for the longest time. Then I noticed something coming towards me in the brush. Something big, and I mean huge. It snapped branches. The cries now were almost deafening. The wind picked up out of nowhere, and I felt as if it was pushing me towards this thing. I was frozen in fear then, so terrified I couldn't even cry out nor shed a tear. As a child, I got scared very easily, and I would run away from everything that popped out at me. I was a notorious crybaby, but this time I was glued to the spot. So afraid that I felt nothing. My mind was completely blank, devoid of all thought. This fear was something other than the normal, typical fear. It's hard to explain. It was almost otherworldly. The next thing I knew, this towering creature was standing before me in the middle of the day. I don't know what it was, and I still don't understand what it was. Somehow, this thing felt ancient and evil, like it was angered that I was in its territory. The anger seethed out of it. It felt colder than ice. Even though the sun was out, it felt as if it was far below zero, at least for me. The clouds began to gather over the sun. This thing wouldn't stop staring me down with cold, icy blue eyes. They were so dark blue they were nearly black. I then noticed it had something in its mouth, something mangled that smelled awful, like rotten and dead. I looked closer. It was a baby doll, one of those that you feed and you can change its diaper. Its voice box had been ripped out of its chest cavity, and the toy kept playing those chilling cries. I thought that was it for me. I thought I was going to end up just like that doll, mangled and dead and rotting in its maw. It was dog-like in appearance, but taller than you would believe, and I swear it had these pointed horns. It was covered in fur and wore a shredded piece of cloth. It grabbed me by my chin with its claws, which smelled of blood and dirt. I don't know what was in me, but I managed to scream. I screamed so loud, the thing let go of me and backed away. Oddly enough, that scream didn't even sound like me. At that point, my face felt like it was on fire. I could feel the ground under me again, but it seemed to melt as the dirt turned to mud where I stood. I didn't know what was happening. But I did shout at the creature again. Before I knew it, my vision had gone white, then black. When I came to, I found myself in the grass near the entrance of the playground. I don't even know how I got there. My body felt like it had gone through 3 marathons in a row, a month of boot camp, and was incinerated at least 3 times. Shakily, I stood up. I found it extremely difficult to move at all, so instead I stopped struggling and lay back down in the grass for at least 20 minutes or so. I lost my sense of time and was confused about where I was. It didn't take me long to realize, because the large crows that lived around there reminded me of where I was. Home. The park. But things were different now. After that experience, I felt as if I'd been living on the gateway to the underworld, and that thing had let me know that humans didn't belong here. Many things happened at this place, and I have too many stories to tell. This was only one about the nightmare hole I lived in for 7 years. I don't know what to call this thing, but to me it looked like a werewolf wendigo hybrid, some sort of demonic being. I also remembered having bat-like wings as well, because when it backed away from me, it sort of flew up off the ground. On another occasion, I saw it fly over the roof of our complex after my parents and I got home from a movie. It was late at night. All I can say is you should never ever go to any small town in Alabama. Not unless you want to live right on top of a gateway to the underworld. Living there for 7 years has made me definitely question reality. I'm not as skeptical as I once was. I never gave it a name, but now I just call it the Gatekeeper. I dread to even think about it. I wonder if it's still out there, watching, waiting for someone else to come alone to that playground. Werewolf in Talladega National Forest, from Alpha Dragon 99. I live in Alabama, and it was a few weeks before my 18th birthday. Being the nature lover I was, my friends Aiden and Maggie invited me to go to the Talladega National Forest for an early birthday present. And of course, I said yes. My friends and I are very outdoorsy people. I met them near the park we always met at for our midday adventures. We hopped in Aiden's truck and began our drive for what seemed like forever. When we got to the campgrounds, everything was normal. People chatting and laughing, having a good time. We found a camping space away from all the other people since Aiden, Maggie, and I aren't the most sociable of folks. Maggie and I made the tent up since we all had decided to sleep in the same tent, while Aiden went to look for firewood. After the day had went by, we put out the fire and nodded off to bed. The following morning, we went for some fishing, but that day something seemed slightly off. Nature had gone awfully quiet. No frogs or anything of the sort making noise around or in the water. Now, I was a very paranoid person. Aiden knew this, and him being a jerk decided it would be fun to screw with my paranoia. He told us he'd be back, that he was going to get a few snacks. So, Maggie and I continued to fish, catching very little, just a couple of brim and catfish. Soon Maggie got worried because Aiden had been gone for a few hours. She left me alone to go look for him, and my paranoia grew worse. Aiden suddenly jumped out of the bushes a few feet from me, making me shriek. I called him a jerk, and I got up to leave. Maggie caught me walking back to the campsite, asking what was wrong. I glared at her and nodded my head to where we were fishing, and she laughed. At the time, I didn't help but feel like she was in on it, so I ran back to the tent and just sat there. When they got back, the sun had already begun to set, and I was playing games on my phone. Aiden apologized for scaring me, tossing me a bag of chips. We cooked and ate what we managed to catch. Then we nodded off after another remotely normal day. The following morning is when it gets weird. We climbed out of the tent, only to find our campsite destroyed. Our packs had been shredded, our cooler knocked over with what looked like claw marks. I wondered how we could have slept through all this. Aiden suggested it was a black bear, but Maggie protested that if it were that hungry, it would have targeted the tent as well. We all tried to forget about it and began to hike into the woods for the day. There was no trail to where we were walking. And again, I noticed that day there were no sounds, nothing, not even birds. Maggie suddenly gasped and started walking away quickly. Aiden looked over and tried to shield what Maggie had seen from me. I pushed him aside and froze. It was a deer, freshly killed, gashes on its neck and stomach. Aiden pulled me away and we started to head back to the camp. I'd been silent the whole time, Aiden holding my wrist, knowing how I am when I'm in shock. I finally shuddered out. That poor deer. What the heck could have done that to it and just left it there? Maggie looked back, suggesting it was a bear. Quickly, Aiden denied that with, "Bears don't just leave their meal like that." We got back to the campsite, and for the rest of the day, I sat in the tent puzzled and sick. Maggie and Aiden were arguing outside for hours about what we'd seen. They returned to the tent, looking at me while I was still in shock. Aiden suggested that we just go to sleep. I didn't sleep, though. I just sat up in my sleeping bag, listening to the sounds outside. Except there were no sounds, not even the wind. Suddenly, a loud howl broke the silence. It shook me. I held my breath listening. Again, a howl came, louder and more angry than before. I could hear something walking in the woods around us. Aiden touched my shoulder and I jumped. He shushed me. He was looking at the side of the tent, and I noticed what he was looking at. A shadow that I could only describe as Professor Lupin's werewolf in Harry Potter was moving around outside. We peeked out the tent flap a little, and we saw it. A massive black wolf-like creature not far from our tent. Maggie woke up and asked aloud, "Why the heck are you guys making so much noise?" Quickly, Aiden grabbed her, covering her mouth, but it was too late. That thing that looked a lot like a werewolf outside was beginning to make its way to the tent. We could now hear it barreling through the woods, and we couldn't get away, so Aiden grabbed his pistol, which he had stolen from his dad. I didn't question it at the time since it was the only means of protection we had, besides my hunting knife. He stood outside the tent and fired a shot off into the air. This seemed to stun the creature as its movement slowed. Aiden yelled, trying to scare it away. Then the creature let out a deep guttural growl as I saw it stand up on two legs, towering over Aiden. This was terrifying, as Aiden himself was 6'2". He yelled at us to run to the truck. It seemed focused on him. We did as he said, but I kept looking back, watching him try to scare this creature. It wasn't long before we heard another shot and a loud, pained howl. Maggie and I only assumed Aiden had shot the creature. Then we heard something running through the forest, and we prepared for the worst. Aiden busted out from the woods though, and he yelled to us to get in. We piled into his truck as I cried, thinking that we were gonna die. Aiden's truck wouldn't start, which worried us. Maggie screamed, and we looked where she was looking. The werewolf's face was pressed against the side window, yellow eyes piercing through to our souls. Its breath fogged up the window. I yelled at Aiden, claiming that all he did was make it more mad. He glared at me, grumbling that now wasn't the time to be all animal lover. The werewolf banged its hands on the truck window, going around the truck, trying to find a way in. Finally, the truck started, and Aiden floored it, startling the beast. Maggie, still freaking out, watching behind us, yelled to drive faster, saying that it was now chasing us. Aiden sped up, and I turned around to get one more look at it. I was amazed that this was happening, but at the same time horrified that it was happening to me. The drive home was long and tiring. We didn't speak about it anymore until a few weeks later, when I explained to them that I wanted to share the story. Aiden encouraged me, but Maggie protested, saying that no one would believe us. So that was our encounter with the Talladega werewolf. I hope nobody has to go through what we went through, but from what I hear, I know we're not the only ones. My creepy experiences. From Ultimate Saint 1. I've had quite a few weird occurrences happen to me throughout my life. I've moved back and forth between the states of Alabama and Iowa for basically all my life, and I got a few new experiences in both places every time I moved. When I was 11 years old, I had already lived in Alabama for about a year, and I was planning on moving to a house just down the street. I had to watch the house by myself when my parents and siblings were getting the new house ready. At the time, I remember playing something on the PS3 in my living room. The TV I was playing on was big, but not modern. It didn't have HDMI, so I was using the old, reliable AV plugs. This TV was also old enough that it made the loud, static noise if there was no input. Well, I was sitting there by myself just gaming out, when suddenly, the static screen cut in, and it was far louder than normal. Now, as this happened, it took me a minute to notice that, within the static, I could hear words. These words said, "Get out." It kept getting louder and louder until I turned off the TV, and I just waited there for my parents. I didn't spend another night there. Before that, when I was 9 years old, I had just moved to Iowa, and I was living at my grandparents'. Now this happened on the first night I was there. My parents and grandparents wanted to go to the bar for the night, so they had my brother, sister, and I sleep in my grandparents' bed, since we hadn't gotten anything else set up yet. After they left, I, at least, was trying to sleep, while my siblings argued, so I figured I'd find somewhere else to sleep. My grandparents' house was 2 stories on the side of a hill, and looking at it from the front, you can only see the top half, but looking at the back, you could see both halves. Their room was on the bottom half in the further back part of the house. Well, I walked up the stairs, and the door to the breezeway was right in front of me. Now, this door was just any normal house door. It had a plastic window that covered the top half of the door with the thinnest curtain I've ever seen covering it. Looking through that window, I saw a couch right in front of it and decided that that's where I was going to sleep for the night. I closed the door behind me and lay down to where I could see the door. Now, this door led to the kitchen, and the kitchen light was always on, and the thin curtain didn't stop really any of it. About 15 minutes of just lying there with my eyes closed, I had this weird feeling to just open my eyes, and when I did, I could not move. Standing directly on my stomach was a pure black being. The thing looked exactly like if you took a model of a gray beard from Skyrim and put the blackest black in existence all over it. I could make out a hood and everything. Looking at this thing for about a minute, I noticed there wasn't any light from the kitchen that got through it. It wasn't transparent at all, but I didn't feel any weight where it stood. I looked at it for about 10 minutes before I just passed out. Later on, after my experience in Alabama, I moved back to my grandparents about a year after that, so I was 12 years old then. This time I shared a room with my cousin that was down the hallway. I slept on the floor facing the door and my cousin slept on his bed. The door to the room had little spaces between the door frame to let in a little light from the hallway if the light out there was left on, but it wasn't too difficult to see much in the dark in that room if there were no lights on. On the night in question, I couldn't sleep very well, so I opened my eyes, and like my previous experience, I saw what looked to be a completely black figure in the middle of the room, except this time, there were 2 black figures. It seemed to be a little boy and a little girl. I couldn't make out too much about the boy, but I could tell the girl had on a dress and had pigtails in her hair. I would see these things every night for about 3 months, before I asked my cousin if he saw them too. He said he did, but he just ignored it. He also told me stories of having friends come over and sleep on the downstairs living room with them, waking up at night and seeing some of my grandma's life-size dolls walking around. I never told anyone what he told me, but I was told by multiple family members that they have seen the same thing. Fast forward another year. The breezeway was cleared out and I made it into my own room. My grandparents had bought me a futon to sleep on, but I wasn't their favorite kid, so they didn't get me a nice one. This thing was basically cardboard with an inch of foam padding on top, and when I laid down on it, it stopped at my knees. It was also hollow inside and only had a thin piece of cloth stapled around the bottom to keep it closed. One night I was lying down trying to get some sleep. I had my head on my right arm to sort of make a pillow out of it. After about 30 minutes of sleep, I began to feel movement under my arm where my head was. It was like there was something in the futon scratching at it. I spent 10 minutes lying like that, thinking, why is this happening? Before I hopped up and turned on the light. Immediately, I flipped the futon over, and all the staples were where they were supposed to be. But I tore it open and saw nothing there. With how intense the scratching had been, how long it lasted, I was sure there was something inside there. I mean, I could feel the futon move up under my arm, but there was nothing there. I moved back to Alabama for about 2 years after that one, but nothing really happened. And after the 2 years were up, I was back living at my grandparents', but they didn't live there anymore. They just rented the house to family. Over time, I would see shadows move and walking around the place, but I still had no idea what was going on. The next story happened when I was about 17. I was still living at my grandparents'. I didn't mention this before, but it was in a city. I still didn't have a car, so I would walk to work and back every day. It was about a 40-minute walk. I would usually get off sometime between 10 and 11 and walk home alone. About 10 minutes into the walk, I always come across this area that has no streetlights. You just have to hope a car passes by, and it's kind of a busy street, so you didn't have to worry too much. On the opposite side of the sidewalk, there was a chain link fence, and on the other side, the ground dropped straight into a tiny creek. I was walking home one summer night, and I get to this spot. All of a sudden, for reasons I can't explain, I decided to stop walking, and I looked straight up. A few stories above me, there was a dark mass with a bright blue ring of light under it. This thing was massive. I don't know how no one else saw it at the time, but it didn't make a single sound. After about 30 seconds of looking at it, it just zipped off into the night. It still made no noise as it went, and it was the fastest object I'd ever seen move. But every now and then, I do see the sky light up blue for a second at night. That brings us to the end of this episode of Darkness Prevails. More terrifying stories are on the way soon, so subscribe and smash that like button. By the way, did you know this show is available as a podcast called Unexplained Encounters? Just search for, follow, and rate Unexplained Encounters on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app. This show is part of the EerieCast network. Go to EerieCast.com for more scary podcasts, such as Freaky Folklore, which explores your favorite monsters, myths, and mysteries, as well as Redwood Bureau, a fictional horror podcast about an agent on the run from an evil secret organization that captures supernatural creatures and entities. Well, thanks for tuning in. Stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.